Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, my videos, everything. So since the last video was quite popular, God knows how that happened. There's quite a few of you new people here, in which case, hi, great to meet you. If you don't know me, my name is Rachel and I make videos on all kinds of stuff, from poetry to science to calling out crappy behaviour and misogyny and transphobia and all that rubbish stuff. To just talking about books and having fun and doing little bits of educational stuff on science and history and anything that interests me. You'll probably also be hearing my little puppy Kyra running around. She does that. She's adorable. She runs this house, you know? She's in charge. She can't be stopped. But since you guys liked the last video on Gabbie Hanna's poetry so much, I have taken your suggestions. I tried to read as many of those comments as I could, taken your feedback, and we are going to be doing a part 2 today, reading more poems from her book, Adultolescence. Oh, why is that so hard to say? Words. They're hard. Now, before we start, I want to play this quick disclaimer from the last video so no one gets offended. I am not a poet myself, I am just a fan of poetry. Could I write better than Gabbie? Almost definitely not. But also, I'm not trying to sell my poetry to anyone else, so... The other thing I will say before we properly get started is that poetry is completely subjective. While we can analyse it and say this is a good poem, this is a bad poem, they're kind of only from kind of technical perspectives. What you like and don't like is completely up to you, and there's no right and wrong there at all. This video is just my opinion and my analysis based on what I do like and don't like in poetry. It is purely my opinion. So if you actually really like Gabbie's poetry, or if you hate a poem that I say that I like or whatever, absolutely fine. And just because I critique a poem that you might like, that doesn't mean I'm putting down your opinion. That does not mean I'm belittling your opinion. You are completely entitled to feel however you want about this work. If it's something that speaks to you, if it's something that is really meaningful to you, then yeah, I'm not looking down on that at all. And I also want to highlight this comment from the last video, which may be my favourite comment that I have of all time. I love it. It's even more funny to me because my niece is named Matilda, so thank you for that. This literally like melted my heart a bit. It was amazing. And so with that, please excuse the fact I'm a little bit sniffly and I'm starting to get a cold today, but let's just jump into reading some poems. Now, the first poem we're going to start with from Gabbie is very simplistic, which in itself is by no means a bad thing. Some of the best poems and even short stories out there are incredibly simple. Think of the short story that was supposed to be like a challenge to write like the saddest or scariest story ever written, and it's just simply for sale, baby shoes, never worn. 6 words, heartbreaking. Writing doesn't have to be long or complicated to, you know, really hit you in the feels. It doesn't have to be overly complex to say a lot. Gabbie's poem is simple. It's basic. It's also an example of her trying out a little wordplay, which I really appreciate, but sadly it just kind of falls flat. It's nice to see that she's attempting something, but the execution is just not quite there. But let's take a look at it. This is her poem Relative. Time is relative. Beauty is relative. Family is relatives. Yeah. So, sadly there's not really a huge amount to unpack when analysing this poem. Sadly. Time and beauty being relative, you know, fairly standard phrases. We use them all the time, you know, basically the whole idea that beauty's in the eye of the beholder, along that kind of thing. Basically saying they're kind of subjective. How we experience them, interpret them is subjective. Time can go faster or slower depending on how you're experiencing the situation, whether you're having fun, whether you're having a hard time, blah, blah, blah. Same with beauty, you know, it's all about who's looking at it, who's experiencing it, and so on. Fairly basic little message there. The family bit, yeah, that's where it kind of starts to get a little more, I don't know, there's more of an attempt at complexity and meaning here, you know? Family, it's often said you can't choose your family. Yeah, we call them relatives. Gabbie's definitely trying to go for a little bit of like irony here and wordplay and so on. Gabbie trying to make the point that, you know, saying maybe we can decide our own family, or she's saying we can't and we're stuck with them. It's a little ambiguous, not necessarily in a good way. It's hard to see what her intended meaning was. Once again, this is an example of Gabbie taking an interesting idea, playing kind of with homographs and homonyms and homophones, in this case homographs, taking that, the idea of playing with it, but never really developing it, never really going any further with it, never really pushing any ideas. So just to kind of like talk about this a little bit further, homographs are words which are spelled the same but have different meanings. Homonyms are similar, but they're words that sound the same but have different meanings. So a homograph could be something like relative and relative, whereas homonyms are things like bear and bear, where and where, you know, that kind of thing. Now, there are a lot of good poems that use similar techniques when it comes to wordplay, some using like homonyms and homographs and so on, some using other poetic devices, all centered around kind of wordplay and so on. And one poem in particular I wanted to contrast with this is one that was specifically written for children. Because a big theme I saw in the comments of the last video was how Gabbie's poems sound and look like they're written for children, which in itself is not a bad thing. Although the fact that she was kind of aiming it at older teenagers and young adults, yeah, kind of shows she's not quite in touch with her audience, but that's not the point here. The point is, poems for children don't have to be bad. Just because a poem is written specifically for children, that doesn't make it a bad poem, and that doesn't make it a lazy poem, and it definitely doesn't mean that the poet hasn't put a lot of time and effort into the poem. It just means there's a different audience. The main differences between poetry written for children and adults is usually that poetry for children has more simplistic language, and it's usually about more child-friendly themes or topics. There's still as much effort that goes into it, similar poetic techniques and devices are used. It can still be as complex in some ways in terms of structure and theme and so on. Mostly the differences are purely to do with theme, topics, and the complexity of language used. Now, having a quick search around for children's poems that use things like homonyms and homographs and other kind of fun wordplay, I found this poem, which wasn't exactly what I was looking for, but it's so fun that I really, really wanted to read it to you and talk about it with you and kind of compare it to Gabbie's poem. One thing you'll notice is Gabbie's poem takes a clever idea and then just kind of lets it fizzle out, I guess you could say, just like, yeah. This poem takes a really interesting idea and has so much fun with it. You'll see that as we read it. It's called Dear Mrs. Teacher, and it's by a children's poet called Ken Nesbitt. Dear Mrs. Teacher, there's notice to say that Brittany is under the weather today. So though Brittany knows how important it is, she can't come to school for today's spelling quiz. It's a fun, silly little rhyme, but what is amazing about this is the spelling. This is a poem that's not just for reading out loud, but for really kind of looking at, and it makes me laugh, it makes me giggle, I love this. It's full of misspellings and homonyms and mixed up words. It's funny, it's ironic, it kind of shows how wonderfully ridiculous the English language is and can be. There's real style and purpose to the poem and its use of language. He had this idea and he used it so well. He's not just using the kind of bad spelling and homonyms for the sake of it. He's not just using it for a gimmick. He's using it to tie it back into this idea of a kid faking a note to get out of a spelling test. The irony there is wonderful. You know, you have the imagery from simple lines like Dear Mrs. Teacher instead of Dear Mrs. Teacher that is going to make kids giggle when they picture that, you know, their teacher as a dear or something like that. The use of homonyms like weather instead of weather, they kind of really make an adult reader stop and think, God, our language is so complicated. This must be impossible for people trying to learn English for the first time. It takes us back to our childhood of, you know, having to deal with those spelling tests and those weird words that all sound the same, but they're all spelled different. It makes us kind of think about, God, the origins of language are so complex and interesting. So even though this is a poem for kids, there's something that adult readers can get out of it as well. Basically, there's just a hell of a lot more going on here than in Gabbie's poems, which is simply just, these words sound the same. Let me make a lazy, undeveloped comparison. I feel like if Gabbie had taken this relative idea further, really developed it, worked on it, done something a little more interesting and unique with it, it could have been fantastic. But like most of the work in her collection here, it feels lazy, sadly. And sorry, my phone is buzzing constantly. Let me just move that and turn it off. Following on from this theme, I want to talk about her laziness. in a poem called Iron. Once again, this is a poem that has a really interesting idea and concept, and it's trying to tell a story, but it just feels lazy. It's undeveloped, it's underworked, it's too basic. Iron. When I was young, my mum used to check if the iron was hot by touching it. And I don't know, I just feel like there's a metaphor in there somewhere. And then there's an illustration of someone touching an iron and some steam coming off, and the person doesn't look like they're in pain. The iron doesn't look like it's even on because of the... Yeah. Lazy poem. Kind of lazy illustration. I'm sorry. It is. The frustrating thing about this poem is that she's literally acknowledging that she could have done something awesome and creative with this idea and this concept, and she won't. It's like she's literally choosing not to. It's like she's acknowledging her laziness and just accepting it. But I mean, this sums up a hell of a lot of Gabbie's poetry, you know? I mean, why should she do the work when she can make the audience do it for her? And I know I said this in my last video, but I just want to, direct your attention to this quote from Stephen Fry again. He wrote that laziness is the worst vice a poet can have. Sentimentality, cliché, pretension, falsity of emotion, vanity, dullness, overambition, self-indulgence, word deafness, word blindness, clumsiness, technical ineptitude, unoriginality. All of these are bad, but they are usually subsets and products of laziness. I want to compare Iron here to a Simon Armitage poem from one of my favourite collections of his. Kyra, you chewing this toy sounds so disgusting, baby. Sorry if you can hear this squeaking in the microphone, sorry. I love you, but you're so gross. Sorry, so, I want to compare this poem, Iron, to a poem from Simon Armitage from Book of Matches. Book of Matches is one of my favourite poetry collections from Simon Armitage because there's a huge range in there in terms of themes and so on. But the idea is each poem is short enough to be read in the time it takes to burn a match, which I think is a really interesting little concept, and it means they're poems that you can kind of flick through quite quickly if you don't have a lot of time, but they're also complex and deep enough that you can really mull over and enjoy if you've got a few hours to spare. Fantastic collection, one of my favourites. Now, this Armitage poem I want to talk about it's called I Am Very Bothered, and it's about this adult looking back on a memory from their childhood and saying, oh, I now see that this seemingly simple action actually had a far deeper meaning. And this is what it is. Armitage, however, takes it one step further by looking at both the immediate and long-term consequences of that action. So not only is he looking at the motive, but how it affected people involved. Again, it's a very simple poem in terms of structure, language, even the story it's telling is quite basic. It's very accessible for everyone. However, in terms of the themes, what it's trying to say, the poetic devices used, it's an incredibly, beautifully complex poem, and it's one of my favourites from Armitage. I am very bothered when I think of the bad things I've done in my life, not least that time in chemistry lab, when I held a pair of scissors by the blades, and played the handles in the naked flame of the Bunsen burner, then called your name and handed them over. Oh, the unrivaled stench of branded skin as you slipped your thumb and middle finger in, then couldn't shake off the 2 burning rings, marked, the doctor said, for eternity. Don't believe me, please, if I say that was just my butterfingered way at 13 of asking you if you would marry me. It's got this wonderful imagery, it's relatable, it's got rhythm, it's got nice little rhymes in there. It really tells a story. It's a wonderful little poem. Here's a man who's saying, I did this stupid thing as a kid, let me tell you the story, and now let me analyze it and try and figure out my motivations, and let me kind of look back on this and think, is this something I should have done or not? We've all done stupid things as teenagers and kids, and looking back, we often cringe at them, or we often kind of think, why did I do that? That was stupid. So it's very relatable in that respect. It's something that I think we've all been through, you know? The thing is, Armitage really kind of goes in depth about his motivations at the time, his analysis now of what his motivations were, and so on. Compare that to Gabbie's just simple, my mum did this sometimes, make of it what you will. Armitage uses these wonderful, wonderful images with things like the naked lilac flame of the Bunsen burner, the unrivaled stench of branded skin. It's so, it really plays on your senses, you know. I think there's a word for that, and I can't think what it is off the top of my head. But, you know, it's almost like you're there, like you can smell it, you can see it. And I want to go back to this Naked Lilac Flame line of the Bunsen burner. I love this because not only does it really set the scene, you know, we've all been there in like a science class with the Bunsen burner and we see that flame dancing. So not only is it relatable in that respect and, you know, it produces this really strong imagery, but calling it a naked lilac flame suggests something quite kind of innocent and delicate to me, you know? But it's not, because it's fire, and fire burns you, you know? So you have this amazing contrast between the naked lilac flame and the flame. Do you know what I mean? It's very much symbolic of how, you know, when you're a kid, you never see danger, do you? You think you can get away with everything and do anything and you're never going to get hurt. These things that as an adult we would look at and think, oh my god, that was dangerous, that was stupid, why do we do that? As a kid, you just look at it and you're like, this is fun, this is cool, this is totally okay. Everything looks like fun and an adventure when you're a kid. Everything looks innocent and exciting. It's only when we get older as adults we start to see, you know, things are going to hurt us. So not only do you have that contrast there between how a child sees a flame and how an adult sees a flame, but it's also a metaphor for kind of love and relationships. When you're younger, everything seems so fun and exciting, and this idea of love is this beautiful naked lilac flame. It's something innocent and exciting and enticing. And when you get older, you realize that, yeah, sometimes you get burnt and sometimes you get really hurt, you know? But I really want you to compare the imagery here of hot things, you know? The naked lilac flame, the stench of branded skin, 2 burning rings. Compare that to simply, the iron was hot. Yeah, there's not really any comparison there, is there? She's the epitome of telling, not showing. There's no imagery, you're not drawn in, you're not really intrigued, you can't really picture being there, and there's no deeper meaning implied or explored. You're told there's a meaning there somewhere, but you're not given a hint as to what it is. I don't think Gabbie even knows what it is, to be honest. And again, lazy and undeveloped, I'm afraid. And it's a shame because it feels like she's starting to clutch at the threads of an interesting idea. She's there and she's trying to reach out, but they're just a little bit too far away. And she just gives up before she's even grasped the thread, never mind start to weave them into something beautiful. And once again, this is a trend in this video of her taking potentially interesting ideas and then doing nothing with them. We see it again in the poem Lotion, which has an idea in it, one particular thing which I think has a hell of a lot of potential, and then it's just abandoned. Lotion, a very basic, simplistic poem, and in itself, I don't think it's that interesting. Have you ever received a gift that was placed inside of a box that was recycled from another, much more intriguing present? Like you pull back the pretty paper and you see iPad packaging, but then you open the lid and inside is a lotion set. I meet a lot of people like that. Exciting outside, disappointing inside. Don't be lotion. So this poem itself isn't that interesting. What is interesting to me is the illustration which accompanies it. It's a bottle of lotion which contains the phrase, disappointment. Like disappointment, an ointment, disappointment. I think that's amazing. For the concept she was going for, of like, you know, exciting on the outside, dull on the inside, and then using the phrase disappointment with that, oh, she could have done some cool stuff with this. She could have done some really clever, creative stuff. And I'm really, really annoyed that she didn't. It's clever, I like it. Why didn't she use it? Why didn't she start playing with that and developing ideas? And God, can you imagine, right, if she changed up that first bit of the poem, cut off those last 3 lines, and then ended the poem with a line like, and inside is just disappointment. It could have been so good! Could have been killer. Is that a phrase kids still use these days? I don't know. Oh God, I dribbled. That wasn't classy. Don't look at me, I'm a mess. Yeah. But one thing I will say that I will commend Gabbie for in that poem is that unlike a lot of her poems, she did at least have a clear idea of the message she wanted to send. She was telling a story throughout it, and she really did get her point across. So I can commend her for that, even if the execution wasn't well done. Yeah, that's what I mean, yeah. To move into a slightly different area, though, I want to look at Gabbie and another poet's attempts at subverting and playing with well-known, I guess you could call them kind of teachings or messages or, not cliches, but kind of well-known things. You'll see what I mean. I'm doing a terrible job of explaining this. So in Gabbie's poem Philosophy, she plays with the famous thought experiment in philosophy, from philosophy, of if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one around to hear it, does it make a sound? I'm sure that's something that most people have heard at one point in their lives. It's very famous. She takes that concept and plays around with it, subverts it, tries to add another meaning to it, and it's quite an interesting idea. And then I want to contrast this with a poem from one of my favourites. We spoke about her in the last video, Grace Nichols. She wrote a poem which references the Christian parable of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Again, even if you're not a Christian, you've probably heard of this parable at some point, the idea of feeding the 5,000, sometimes known as feeding the multitude, that sort of thing. These aren't obviously like exact comparisons. One's taking a like philosophical thought experiment, one's taking a parable from a religious text, but both are subverting them and using them as references to make another point, and I thought it would be interesting to kind of compare them. So first up, Philosophy by Gabbie Hanna. If you eat an entire pizza by yourself in the woods and no one's around to see it, do the calories count? Very simple poem, very simple play on the philosophical idea and thought experiment. If we're being generous, we can say this is some kind of statement about society's views of women and diet and body image, and how we're often very judgmental of people for eating too much or not eating enough or eating the wrong things or being on a fad diet or not dieting at all or not doing them, doing them, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean. Sometimes people feel the need to hide what they're eating from people. Sometimes other people don't feel comfortable eating in public. This, if we're being generous, could be a statement about this kind of thing all wrapped up in a kind of question. It's not a terrible idea. It's an interesting topic. It's just not that well executed. It's okay, but I think it could have been better. It reads more like something you'd see on r/shower thoughts than in a published collection of poetry like this. There's no obvious poetic techniques used. There's not even a real rhythm to it, at least not one that feels intentional anyway. If you write an entire poem without any poetic technique, is it still a poem? Yeah, I'm not sure. On the other hand, I want to compare this to a little poem from Grace Nichols. Hi, me from the future here, re-recording this bit because I hated how I read this poem and just kind of wanted to get it right for you, so let's redo this bit. This is called Why Shouldn't She? My mother loved cooking, but hated washing up. Why shouldn't she? Cooking was an art she could move her lips to. Then, the pleasure, feeding the proverbial multitude. Us, on less than a loaf and 2 fishes. Yeah, that was better. I don't know why that was so hard before. Again, incredibly simple poem, but obviously a lot more work went into this one, I feel. You've got an obvious rhyme scheme and structure in there. You've got a very obvious rhythm that feels very natural to read. And here the ideas expressed about gender roles and family relationships and growing up in poverty even are so much deeper. There's so much more to it than just here's an inference that could potentially be about diet culture. It's not just a matter of, does my diet still count if I lie to the people around me? And even then, we're not even sure if that's actually what Gabbie's saying, because it's all just very vague and underdeveloped. It's more of, this is Grace saying we grew up without much, and my mum still managed to feed us and please us and make an art out of feeding like a swarm of hungry kids, despite not having any real money or possessions or money for fancy food or even a lot of food, you know? You know, this is a poem about a mother's endurance and skill and love for her kids, and she's comparing it to the actions of a supposed god. You know? She's literally comparing her mother to Jesus. That's how much love and respect and admiration she has for her mother, and it's impossible to not feel emotionally affected by this poem, despite it being so short and simple. You've also got more subtle themes in this poem from Grace Nichols. Messages about art and creativity and how it's often more enjoyable to, create than have to deal with the consequences. Cooking is creating, washing up is dealing with the consequences, but both need to be done. And by the mother, both are done. And, there's a hell of a lot to respect in that. I'm not sure if, with this comparison, I'm being a little too harsh on Gabbie, because Gabbie's poem isn't one that I relate to personally, whereas Grace's is. I grew up in a family without very much, and so seeing my mum and dad, my dad did most of the cooking, to be honest. My mum worked a minimum wage job in a supermarket, and my dad looked after me and cooked and all that kind of thing. And so seeing them kind of scrape together and cope and, make do with what we had, I guess I can relate to Grace's poem a lot more. So I'm not sure if maybe I'm just, I don't know, if I'm being too harsh because I can relate to one more than the other, but at the same time, Gabbie's poem doesn't make me feel the same things as Grace's does, and I don't know if it's because of the message or because it just lacks any real emotional depth. Anyway, this isn't just about me and my thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts on all of this as well. Let me know down in the comments. Am I kind of missing something in Gabbie's poems here? Am I just not guessing it? Is there something in here that I'm just not seeing? Is it a lot more complex than, I've read it to be? I don't know, let me know down in the comments because I always appreciate your thoughts. The last two poems I want to cover very, very briefly in this video because again, we're getting on a bit. Just like last time, I talk a lot, you'll get used to this. The last two poems I want to cover tell us a lot about Gabbie's relationship with poetry and just thinking and creating for herself in general. Now, I'm not going to be comparing these to anyone else's poems, we're just looking at Gabbie's here. One of them is called Dreams, and I think this tells us a lot about, well, okay, let me read it and you can see for yourself. My therapist tells me what my dreams mean, and I believe him, the way you believe your teacher when he tells you what a poem means. This tells us so much about Gabbie's relationship with poetry and authority and creating, and just the literary process in general, but I'm not quite sure what her point is, and it could be very ambiguous. So for me, I've never had a teacher tell me what a poem means. I've had a teacher ask me what he thinks a poem means. By the way, for all these videos, shout out to Mr. Brooke and Mrs. Cunliffe. You guys at A-Level were amazing, and you are the reason I am making these videos today. So yeah, so I've never had that. So if someone came up to me and said, this is what a poem means, I would be like, yeah, but is it? Can I figure it out for myself? So maybe she is saying that her therapist is trying to tell her what things mean and she's like, no, can I figure it out for myself? Or maybe she's just saying that she blindly accepts whatever authority figures tell her. I don't know, but either way, it's telling. The other poem I want to talk about is called Fluent, and there's a hell of a lot more to unpack in here, and this is the one I really want to focus on. As of late, since this book deal, I speak in strictly poetry. My sentences are metered, and heroic couplets flow freely. Every minuscule moment is a latent freeform verse. My hyperbole or imagery, I'm not sure which is worse. Every brute or object is a potential metaphor. My art form is heartache peppered with delusions of grandeur. Slippery similes slip off my tongue to an insufferable degree. Each turn I take to talk is an ostentatious soliloquy. Dousing my friends in leaden pretension is something I do fear. I wish that I could take a break, but my deadline's growing near. Now, I actually want to really commend her for this because she has some really interesting techniques in this. Her rhythm is pretty much on point. She has some nice little rhyming couplets. She's using good language. She's using alliteration in places. She's got some metaphors in there. There's some excellent stuff going on. And honestly, it's not that bad. I do find it a little bit ironic, though, that she's talking about things like meter and imagery and metaphors when I've yet to find any real solid examples of them in the rest of this collection. Little bit ironic. At least not examples that are used both well and intentionally at the same time. I do think the last lines, though, are incredibly revealing about her approach to her poetry in general. You know, I wish I could take a break, my deadline's growing near. I've said throughout both videos now that I feel Gabbie rushed a lot of these poems. A lot feel lazy, half-formed ideas without any kind of development. And I think maybe this is because she felt a deadline pressure, and it's because she definitely went for quantity over quality, which is the biggest mistake anyone can make, really. I kind of get why she does, though, because I think part of it is to do with what it's like to be a YouTuber in general. You know, despite what the YouTube gods say, the algorithm does punish you for taking a break. I had to take like a month and a half off earlier this year for health stuff, and my growth dropped to nothing. Absolutely nothing. And it's taken me like 3 months to try and get back to like a good place again where I was at the start of the year. Yeah, you do feel a constant need to be putting out regular content, and often that means you produce more quantity than quality, which obviously is a real shame and a real problem, but when you have bills to pay, it's not a lot you can do about it. Often you just need to get something out there even when you know it's not your best work. So I understand that, and I feel like Gabbie has taken that same approach to creating and applied it to her poetry, which again is a real shame. You know, I mean, and not only that, but we live in a time where there's this real culture of, I guess, embracing instant gratification. You know, you take a photo, you want to post it to Instagram immediately and get those likes and those comments. You make a video, you want to get it online as soon as possible, and then as soon as that's out there, you're thinking about the next one. As soon as the comments stop coming in at speed, you're like, okay, well, how do I get the next thing out there? That's definitely the kind of world a lot of us live in, and it's not necessarily a good thing. And that's what I think Gabbie has done with a lot of these poems. She wanted to put this book together, throw it out there, and get that instant feedback. And sadly, you can't do that with poetry. It means that her ideas aren't fully formed. They aren't really thought out or developed. I can almost guarantee that out of every poem in this book, not one of them has been rewritten 20 or 30 times until they're almost unrecognizable, but a noticeable improvement on the original draft. Look at any of the big poets that we've looked at in either one of these videos, and I can almost guarantee that the poems we've read today aren't anything like the first drafts that they put out. That just doesn't happen very often. When a poet puts together a collection like this of, how many are in this, do you think? Probably about, I don't know, 40, 50 poems in this little collection from Grace Nichols. When a poet puts out a collection like this, she is going to be writing and rewriting and developing these poems, throwing certain bits out, cutting bits out, editing, until you come to this, to the magic, to the beauty, to the art. It's all about adding and taking away and changing and altering and tweaking until you find the magic, what makes it special. I find it hard to believe that Gabbie has done that with many of these poems, maybe a few, but I don't know if it's that many. I feel like for the money she's charging for this book, I would rather spend that money on, say, 10 really excellent poems that Gabbie's really taken her time on than this volume of like 100 or so incredibly mediocre, forgettable, or just bad poems. Actually, I'm not sure how many is in Gabbie's book, it's a few, but for that same amount of money, I'd rather have fewer excellent poems than this jumble of unfinished, honestly mediocre poems. When I say Gabbie's poetry is bad or disappointing, I don't mean she's beyond help, not at all. I think she has some interesting ideas, and she just needs to edit more, she needs to work on them more, she needs to develop them more, she needs to spend a little more time with each poem instead of scribbling down and going on to the next one, scribbling and going on to the next one. But yeah, that's just my opinion, I guess. I would love to know what you guys think of these poems and the ones I talked about in my first video on this topic, and the other poems in her book if you've read it. I do have a whole other video's worth of content about this book, but I don't want you guys to get bored. I don't want to be doing the same thing too much. So if it's something you're interested in, I'll do it after Christmas. There is a really interesting little kind of attempt at a love poem, I think, from Gabbie that I want to compare to one of my favourite Shakespeare sonnets of all time that I think could be very, very interesting. So if that is something you want to see, let me know down in the comments. But for now, thank you for watching today. I appreciate you guys so much. And if I don't see you until after Christmas, I hope you all have a wonderful holiday period and have lots of fun. And yeah, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching.